Well, joining us from Washington, D.C. is Dr. Aparna Pande, the Director of Future of India and South Asia Initiative with the Hudson Institute. Of course, book has just released in India. She's the author of Making India Great and the Promise of a Reluctant Global Power. And before that, of course, from Chanakya to Modi, the evolution of India's foreign policy. Also, a pleasure to introduce Shuja Nawaz, a distinguished fellow with the South Asia Center at the Atlantic Council, and also the author of The Battle for Pakistan, The Bitter US Friendship and a Tough Neighborhood, and Crossed Swords, Pakistan, its army, and the wars within. Dr. Pandey and Mr. Nawaz, thank you so much for giving us your time.
Thank you, Amitabh. Pleasure.
Good to be with you.
Mr. Nawaz, as you notice, I've pinched a little bit of your book in our title there, Crossed Swords. We just wanted to go into what your reading of Shah Mehmood Qureshi's statements, public statements against Saudi Arabia, and post that, what happened with both General Bajwa and the ISI chief rushing off to Saudi Arabia. What's your reading of why those statements were made so publicly? Of course, it was a rebuke of Saudi Arabia in terms of not leading the OIC charge against Jammu and Kashmir.
It was strange, and it probably reflects the lack of coordination inside the cabinet. And it's not the first time that this has happened. Indeed, when the statement was made by the foreign minister, the Minister for Human Rights, Shiri Mazari, who at one time people thought might be a contender for the foreign ministry when this government came into power, immediately criticized him because the relationship between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia is ancient. It goes way back, and it is very deep, and it is multifaceted. And although the Kashmir issue has been raised within the OIC, and there is a group within the OIC that is keeping tabs on Kashmir. The reason why Pakistan wanted to move rapidly on it was to garner more international attention to it. The Prime Minister had spoken at the United Nations. The Prime Minister gave a very long lecture, as it were, at his first meeting at the OIC also, about the need for the Muslim countries to get together. But the problem that I see is that the OIC is really underwhelmed with its ability to bring the Muslim world together. 1.8 billion people, 1.8 billion different views. And the Saudi role in OIC remains extremely powerful. So other countries are now vying to take over leadership on particular regional issues. That includes Turkey, includes Qatar, includes Malaysia, and Pakistan wants to join that group.
Right. Well, I just go to Dr. Pandey. Just a request, Mr. Nawaz, if you could move slightly towards your right here, slightly off center. Dr. Pandey, there were lots of theories, and whether they're conspiracy theories or not, about why Mr. Qureshi raised that, in the manner in which he raised that, including that maybe parts or the whole military was looking at replacing Imran Khan, or he himself was looking at some kind of a position upwards. What's your reading, Dr. Pandey?
So what I would say is that yes, I mean, Mr. Qureshi has for a long time sought to become Prime Minister, but then most politicians in the cabinet would want to. So I wouldn't say that he's the only one. I'm sure there are other contenders. But I would say, there's a sort of, this problem is at one level not new. Pakistan's relations with Saudi Arabia are old, as Mr. Nawaz mentioned. They are old and they are close. I mean, Saudi Arabia provides, not just economic bailouts, but remittances, jobs, and also oil on concessional terms.
Yeah.
The problem has been that at periodic intervals, Pakistan has sought more from its all its allies, than its allies are willing to give. So it's not just Saudi Arabia, it's China, it's United States. There's a presumption that Pakistan is more important to that ally than that ally is to Pakistan. And so you are asking Saudi Arabia to do more on Kashmir, and it's not new. We can go back in decades. Pakistan pushed against Saudi Arabia in 1950s against India, in the 1960s and 70s when Saudi Arabia actually asked for India to join OIC. And so over the decades, there's always been that if you care more for Pakistan and for the Muslim world, why don't you do more? So I think part of this outburst is domestic, but part of it is also a unwillingness to realize changing global realities. Whether we like it or not, Saudi Arabia will make decisions based on how they see the world, how they see their relationship with India and Pakistan, and what are their priorities at that time. I mean, sort of, demanding that Saudi Arabia does something on a timeline which is important for Pakistan domestically, is sort of expecting too much of an ally which has actually done a lot for Pakistan over the years.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Mr. Nawaz, is coming to you now, those realities that each individual country, whether they're doing it on their own or in groups, have recognized or are working towards their national interests, whether it's Saudi Arabia, whether it's India, whether it's Pakistan, the US, etc. Your thoughts on that?
Well, as Aparna just mentioned, all countries act in their own enlightened self-interest. And that's the reality of politics. Pakistan can take only so much advantage out of its strategic location. The rents that it has sought over the years and that it has received due to that strategic location can only go so far. I think Pakistan will need to stand on its own feet. And in some perverse way, perhaps this re-examination of the codependency between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan will probably settle in a new pattern, which will be much more realistic. Because remember that Pakistan also turned down the Saudi request for actual assistance in the war in Yemen.
Yeah.
And they did it the Turkish way, which was they went to their parliament, and parliament said, no, we can't do it, which was what they ought to have done when they were invited to participate in the US invasion of Afghanistan by the United States. Pakistan needs to use its own political institutions. Now, as far as the current imbroglio is concerned, I think it's partly the personality and the peak that was shown by the foreign minister. It may partly be internal positioning within the cabinet for strength.
It's interesting that you're raising that, Shuja Sahib. If I can just put on a question that is coming from Good Vibes. Tanuj Abe Khanna says, can this be seen as the establishment's efforts to sabotage Prime Minister Imran Khan since his 2-year report card has been below expectations? Go on with your thoughts.
Well, the establishment, by which I assume you mean the military, doesn't need to send subtle signals. The establishment in Pakistan has considerable power, and there is a direct relationship that has been established between the Prime Minister and the military establishment, particularly the Army Chief and the Director General ISI. They meet regularly. So if there are messages to be passed, I'm sure that they'll be passed privately and in a much more effective manner than getting the foreign minister to say something like this. Remember that Foreign Minister Shah Mehmood Qureshi did something similar at the time when the US strategic dialogue
with America,
with the United States. And instead of preparing for that very critical visit that ended up in the White House, and President Obama walked in also, he ended up leaving the capital and going to spend the weekend in Lahore. And it was General Kiani at that time, the Army Chief, who called a meeting of all the leading participants in government to prepare for that. So he has done this before. Whether it was done as part of a plan or whether it was a spur of the moment decision to garner attention is not clear.
Dr. Pande, now subsequently what's happened is both General Bajwa and the ISI DG, Lieutenant General Faiz Hamid, went to Saudi Arabia. They met the Deputy Defense Minister, people that they would have met if it was a routine visit. Reports suggesting that there's been a snub from the Crown Prince, that some award that was to be given wasn't given. No official comments, but we do hear that the Saudis have already asked for repayment of 1 billion of the 3 billion that they had given, and even another repayment and a freeze on that oil deal that you were referring to. So those messages, how do you read the Saudis reacting to what Mr. Qureshi said?
So I believe it's a part Saudi reaction to what Mr. Qureshi said, but part also to something which Shuja Saab referred to earlier, which is that Pakistan, it's the broader geopolitics in the Muslim world, right? Pakistan has always played a bigger role in that, and has sought to sort of in the last few years, especially carve out a group which is, with Malaysia and Iran and Turkey. One of the conferences Pakistan did not participate in because Saudi Arabia was not very happy. But the Pakistan, and the Pakistan-Turkey relationship is again something which Riyadh isn't very comfortable with. So the part of it has to do with that. The other part is the fact that Mr. Qureshi went to China at the same and he has got an audience with the foreign minister, which has been broadcast at the same time that General Bajwa had to go. The military and intelligence had to go to repair the relationship with Saudi Arabia, and yet they were not able to meet MBS. Now, it could be a message from MBS that, you need to do more. And that is why you also need to repay the 1 billion, which actually China has paid. So it's interesting. I would say it also demonstrates, that the play between the two current, I would say, ideological and symbolic allies who Pakistan has, Saudi Arabia and China. They have over the years normally provided support on the diplomatic and symbolic, whether it's UN or OIC. They've also been seen as countries which could help Pakistan against India and build its economic resources, provide oil or build infrastructure. But there's a tension there where Saudi Arabia doesn't appear to be playing along all the dimensions, whereas China appears to be giving a lot more to Pakistan. Let's see how that plays out, and whether whether this makes Pakistan closer to China, or the Saudi relationship is not going to go anywhere. Pakistan will remain dependent on Saudi Arabia for multiple reasons, and breaking off ties with Saudi Arabia will hurt Pakistan in the greater Muslim world. So let's see how it plays out. But I think it's an interesting game which is being played right now.
Shuja Saab, Mr. Nawaz, in terms of China, now again reports suggesting that China stepped in to help repay that loan of $1 billion. How do you see China fitting into this whole equation, especially since Mr. Qureshi is currently having the second strategic foreign ministerial dialogue with Wang Yi, the state council, and foreign minister in Hainan?
Well, the Chinese play a very long game, and they are very important neighbors for Pakistan. They share a boundary with Pakistan, and the relationship over the years has been marked by Chinese advice to Pakistan not to forsake its other friendships and other relationships. Even with the United States, the Chinese have not said it's either them or us. They said you need to maintain your relationship with the rest of the world while building our relationship bilaterally. And Pakistan needs to follow that good advice, I think, rather than going like a pendulum from one side to the other, in which case it may come out the loser. But I go back to my earlier point. I think this little contretemps, to use the proper French word for what's happening, is really an opportunity for Pakistan to reassess its position and to strengthen its own ability to stand on its own feet, rather than become totally dependent on one side or the other. Remember that it has to maintain a good relationship with Iran, with whom Pakistan shares a massive border. And in fact, there are pluses and minuses to that. In fact, the whole COVID situation in Pakistan didn't come from China, it came from Iran. Trade is possible with Iran. And if sanity prevails in Washington at some point, the Iran-Pakistan-India pipeline might become a reality, which will help bridge the gaps between countries in South Asia, particularly between India and Pakistan. So there's a lot more that could emerge out of this re-examination. And it's not a question of breaking ties with Saudi Arabia. I don't think Pakistan will ever do that. It's simply a question of rebalancing the relationship and then going back to the OIC and saying, okay, you've got a group on Kashmir. You're supposed to help Muslim communities throughout the world. India has one of the largest Muslim communities in the world. What are you doing with Kashmir? And see what answer.
Sure. Dr. Pande, the Saudi equation and many countries in the Gulf, even Iran and UAE and Qatar, the Indian relationship with, is that playing any role in how the Saudis are behaving to what Pakistan has been requesting in terms of the OIC, that is?
I would say yes, and it is old. I mean, if you notice among the countries on the OIC, Saudi Arabia has actually, by and large, sort of avoided entering into the India-Pakistan or Kashmir thing directly, and it has actually sort of tried to get both sides to sort of behave better and get along. I mean, yes, I mean, sort of you can see it over the years. I mean, the Saudi king has visited India. The Saudi king, going back, I think 2006 was when then King Abdullah visited and referred to India as his second home. Again, remittances, a lot of remittances come to India, a lot of jobs. It's also, India and China are one of the top two countries whom Saudi Arabia supplies oil to. Saudi Arabia is among the top 4 or 5 countries, along with Iraq and earlier on Iran, which supply oil and gas to India. So Saudi, there's that oil and energy relationship. There's also investment. I mean, India has sought investment from the Saudi wealth funds as well as the UAE. So it's Saudi Arabia, UAE, I mean, Qatar to some extent, Iraq, with whom India has very good relations. Economic, the cultural side, but also economic, energy. And so that, and finally, as the world changes, let's go 40,000 feet up. As the US may or may not be in a sort of, in a mood of semi-isolating or withdrawing from certain parts of the world, countries will start looking at who are the other players in the region with whom we need to have a better relationship. So India is a country, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries have built relations with and want better relations with. They want them with China, but they also want it with India. They don't want any country becoming too powerful in the region, and they would like these countries and build strategic relationship, defense relationship, military exercises. India is helping build the port in Oman, Duqm. India has military exercises with Saudi Arabia, with UAE, Bahrain. So there are, it's an economic, military, but also geopolitical relationship because the world is changing. So yes, that will make a difference. I mean, will Kashmir come up in OIC? Yes. Will it be the only way that OIC looks at India? No.
Shuja, when we were talking before this program started, you were stressing on how countries look at their national interests, and you brought that up even in this discussion. In terms of the Saudi equation vis-a-vis India, Saudi equation vis-a-vis Pakistan, I believe you have a lot to say about, say, trade, for example, right?
Yes, and Saudi Arabia's trade with India far exceeds its trade with Pakistan. Even though it's a smaller percentage of the total trade of the two countries. Pakistan's trade with Saudi Arabia is about 7% of its total trade, whereas for India and Saudi Arabia, it's closer to 1%. But the numbers are there. And going back to what Aparna was saying, the relationship goes way back. I recall even following the Mumbai attacks, there was counterterrorism cooperation between Saudi Arabia and India, which led to the extradition of one of the persons who worked under a pseudonym, who was captured by the Saudis and handed over to the Indian authorities. That kind of relationship continues to expand and grow, and the military relationship also will expand and grow. So it's not a question of either or. I think, for the Saudis, particularly as they now get into a tough economic and financial spot themselves. They have a budget deficit. They've now actually imposed a VAT, a tax on their own people instead of an income tax. And all of these difficulties will rearrange their economic relationships and priorities. The one thing that is bothersome for the whole region is the continuation of the Iran confrontation with the Gulf states, with the backing of Saudi Arabia. I don't think this is going to benefit the region. It's not going to benefit either Iran or the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia. So Pakistan had offered to play a mediating role, but I don't think that that was going to fly. And it was just something that hadn't been prepared on the ground before it was suggested by Prime Minister Imran Khan. But maybe behind the scenes, there's a possibility for the OIC to play a role in sorting out that relationship so that there is no perception of mutual threats, either from Iran on the Arab world or from the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia on Iran itself. I think that will help trade and it will help movement of people and ideas. And that's going to benefit the 67 members of the OIC much more than simply meeting for symbolic purposes and saying we represent 1.8 billion people. That is just talk.
In fact, let me just, Iran, of course, it's so fascinating, but let me just take another point that's been brought up by Sathe, I think, when Shira Saab's talking about the OIC. Pakistan, Turkey, and Malaysia talk about the Muslim Ummah. However, they're quiet on atrocities on, say, the Uighurs in next door China, as their economic interests are involved with China. Hypocrisy at best. So, I mean, on one hand, you're saying Jammu and Kashmir, Muslim Ummah, but there is absolutely no comment on what's happening with the Uighurs because of China.
And that has been spoken about. That particular issue has been raised a number of times, and you will not get an on-the-record statement from the government of Pakistan because of the relationship with China. The same from Turkey. But they have been speaking about Burma, and they've spoken about Rohingya.
Yes.
So the question is, can much more be done behind the scenes for the Uyghurs? Now, remember that when Pakistan moved its troops into Fatah to clear the area, one of the groups that they got rid of was a very small group of Chinese that the Chinese had pointed out to them were using Fatah as a training ground. And the other group was the ETIM, the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, which was also operating in Xinjiang. So Pakistan, behind the scenes, can do much more for the people of Xinjiang than coming out and beating its chest and proclaiming something against China, which would damage the broader relationship that Pakistan has.
Sure. Dr. Pande, do you want to make a comment on that?
Yeah, just a quick comment. Actually, I mean, the Uyghur issue and the reluctance to bring it up in any international fora, especially OIC, goes back decades. I mean, Pakistan has actually championed most Muslim causes around the world, but Xinjiang and Uyghur has been left out because of the relationship with China. So this is not Prime Minister Imran Khan. We can go back and see at sort of, Pakistan has gone out of the way. If you recall, in the Beijing Olympics, General Musharraf has promised and said that, there will not be any problems, and the Uyghurs and the Xinjiang, I mean, there won't be any problems about sort of emanating from sort of any groups which may be. And so it's something which is older, something which Pakistan sort of, to keep the relationship with China, Pakistan has ignored. I agree, maybe, having a conversation behind doors, but then that could apply to Kashmir, that could apply to Chechnya, that could apply to everything. We should keep the same sort of, if we are talking about issues, all issues should be there. Otherwise, it shows that at the end of the day, countries care about their national interest and not about human rights.
Shuja Sahab, again, since we were talking about Iran earlier, I want to get your thoughts on how do you see China, CPEC, the BRI with Pakistan, and these reports which are still unofficial about the $400 billion 25-year strategic partnership with Iran?
Well, many are seeing this as the broader Chinese game. The Belt and Road Initiative has a very critical element that goes into Central Asia. And the whole idea behind that is to draw the economies of those countries towards the east rather than towards the west, towards Russia. The Chinese have also, over the decades, tried to develop the north-south corridors for pipelines and roads between Iran and Central Asia, and then on to China, because that's a much safer route for them to get their energy from China than using the long route through the Gulf and through the Malacca Straits, which could be interdicted at any time. And so the Chinese have now put their money where their mouth is, and they basically push back on the American threats of sanctions also by saying that these are old arrangements. We are simply putting them into effect now. And that's how they've gotten over.
Do you see it a continuation of CPEC through Pakistan, or do you see it as some kind of a different?
It's parallel. It is parallel, and I think Pakistan needs to be careful in how it implements its own CPEC projects, because if those are delayed for any reason, or if there are any difficulties within the country, then China will have this other opportunity. Pakistan's advantage there is, of course, the immediate proximity, that you don't have to go through Central Asia to go to the Gulf. You go directly from China through Pakistan to the Gulf and to East Africa. And I think that's an advantage that Pakistan can certainly benefit from. However, the relationship between the two countries will depend a lot on the efficiency with which these projects are implemented.
Sure.
And I think this is going to be critical in the final analysis. It's not simply a question of MOUs and paper agreements.
Yeah, of course. Dr. Pande, if you want to make a comment on whether you see Iran as a parallel route that the Chinese are looking at, and also wanted you to talk about the Pakistani movement towards, which was referred to earlier, Turkey, Malaysia, especially since they are seen as more hardline on at least the India-Kashmir issue.
So quickly, yes. I mean, this is part of, as Shuja Sahab said, part of China getting over the Malacca dilemma. Also, building its infrastructure and getting access to oil and energy using the land routes. The only problem I would say is, yes, you can use local currency, you can use renminbi, the Soviets used rubles, but we shouldn't forget what the Hong Kong chief executive said a few days ago, that she could not use her credit card because of the American sanctions. So at the end of the day, we are still all dependent on a dollar economy. Until that changes drastically, most countries will have to keep that in mind if the American sanctions and most banks don't want to face, or most credit card companies. So we have to bear that in mind. About the relations with Turkey and one of it's actually in some ways very old. If you go back to the 1950s, then General Ayub had wanted a partnership between Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran and Turkey. And in some ways Cento or Baghdad Pact. So it's an old Pakistan desire that you should have a grouping of countries which are Muslim, which are which border each other, and in this case which have similar they want a new Muslim grouping which can act faster on certain issues. Yes, Malaysia and Turkey and Iran at some level have criticized India on Kashmir. But I won't say that, at the end of the day, their trade with India is more than their trade with Pakistan. They are not going to break off their relations with India. I would see it more as, at some level, playing geopolitics and playing to domestic sentiments. And in the case of Turkey, Mr. Erdogan's own Ottoman desires.
Yeah, correct. If I can get, you should just have to comment on this. You were talking about parallel in terms of China and CPEC through Iran, but do you visualize any kind of parallel movement within the Islamic world?
I think there's room for sub-regional groupings to act in their own interest. And what Aparna was referring to earlier, there was a fairly successful attempt to carve out a relationship between Turkey, Iran, and Pakistan during the rule of the Shah and President Ayub. It was called Regional Cooperation for Development. But go back a little further, and you had Pakistan at the behest of the United States joining something called the Baghdad Pact. At which point, if you recall, the Saudis actually objected. They didn't want Pakistan to join this alliance because they saw it as against the Muslim world, against the Arab world. And so there's been a change in that, of course. The Saudi dependency on the United States has increased tremendously. Even though they are major importers of US arms, they are also dependent on the United States. And it's the dollar, as Aparna was saying, in which they trade. And it's also New York, where they keep their money and their investments, that is going to be the tool that will be used to put pressure on them. As far as Iran is concerned, remember, whenever there are sanctions, there are ways to bypass them. And there are legal ways, and two of them in economics. One is, of course, barter, and the other is counter trade. Counter trade is when you have different people selling different things, and then having a clearinghouse that takes care of the exchange of material. So one side needs something else, another side needs something else. They put their stuff in a third party. That party finds what they need, and they work out their sums and their math, and things are okay. That's what Iran has been doing, and it's been doing it for decades. And I think that is one way of bypassing sanctions and not using dollars. On credit cards, very interesting. The Iranians continue to have a very powerful economic relationship with the UAE, despite the fact that the UAE is the hub of the United States counterterrorism financial operations. Because when people travel to Iran, they can't use their credit cards. Those cards are physically, and this is based on experience from somebody who told me of what happened to him. On a trip to Iran, the hotel took his card. It was actually physically taken to Dubai. And then he was told that you will receive a request for payment of some goods that you bought in Dubai, and that will cover your hotel bill. So there are ways of getting around. It's just,
of course, there are ways, but it's really difficult. I know I'm running out of time, but I wanted you both to make quick comments on what the UAE, Israel, and America deal means. Dr. Pande?
I sort of, at some level, it is something which is long overdue, right? I mean, sort of, ever since Egypt and Jordan recognized Israel, it was a matter of time. And among the countries in the Gulf region, UAE has actually had reasonably pragmatic relationship. I mean, leadership, and so I would say it dates to that, and it dates to UAE sort of, also sort of, close relationship with the US. So it's partly reality, partly trying to push the Arab world into sort of moving beyond either or and accepting what facts on the ground.
And both domestic positive notes for Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump. Shuja Saab, your quick comments on that?
Well, there have been relationships established over the years between Pakistan and Israel through South Africa. And at one time, if you recall, President Musharraf also was on the verge of preparing for recognition of Israel as an entity in order to better engage with it on behalf of the Palestinians. I think Prime Minister Imran Khan has taken a much more fixed position on that and has reiterated it recently. But to go back to the broad issue, I think, which is Kashmir and India-Pakistan relations and how they impinge their relationships with the Saudis and with the Gulf state, I think it will be very critical for leaders in Pakistan and in India to look at the effects of the COVID-19 crisis. We haven't talked about that at all. This is going to have far-reaching effects. The holes that both India and Pakistan find themselves in an economic sense, they're not going to get out of this till 2030. I mean, India's growth rate has already plummeted to 3%. Pakistan's is minus 0.4%. This is not enough. They need to create 12 to 15 million new jobs a year in India and 1 million new jobs a year in Pakistan. They're going in the opposite direction. You have tens of millions of people out of work as a result of COVID, and you've got wage earners, over 100 million of them, roughly 100 million perhaps, who are out of work in India. This is what needs to be focused on, and it will be important to look at the region and trading relationships among countries in the region much more than getting into tiffs and spats about who said what. I think there needs to be a rethink of foreign policy on a strategic level rather than aiming in a Trumpian way to strengthen your base.
Absolutely, but we know politicians and their priorities. Shuja Sahab, again, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it a lot. Dr. Pande, I do know you have another engagement as well. Thank you both for appearing on Talking Point. And a reminder to our viewers, just log on to our website to get all the latest news and analysis from an Indian perspective. You follow us on our social media handles on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And you can just click on the bell icon on YouTube to get reminders before we put up videos like this one. You've been watching Talking Point. I'm Amit Abri.